Are there any senators wishing to vote or change their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 39, the nays are 54. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont, we need order. Order in the Senate.
President, the Senate is still not in order.
Please, Senators, take your conversations outside the chamber if needed. Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I wish to yield to the Senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President.
Senator from Louisiana.
I offer this amendment. It is a technical amendment, 3 technical but important changes to the Child Citizenship Act of 2000. Senator Coates, Senator Blunt, and Senator Klobuchar have helped lead the effort on this. I've explained it numerous times on the floor, and I think the leaders have agreed on a voice vote.
Mr. President, I understand we are...
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I've spoken with the distinguished ranking member, Senator Grassley. I understand we're able to agree the Landrieu amendment by voice vote. I ask unanimous consent the 60-vote threshold to respect the amendment be waived.
Without objection.
And, Mr. President, move the question.
Question is on the Landrieu amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed? Ayes appear to have it. Ayes do have it. Amendment is agreed to.
Mr. President,
Under the previous order, there will now be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to a vote on amendment number 1228, offered by the senator from Louisiana, Mr. Vitter.
And, Mr. President, before we do
Senator from Vermont.
I've been asked to make a request that the...
It's already 10 minutes. Just have to remind him.
No, I just want to remind everybody the next vote will be a 10-minute vote.
Mr. President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, this amendment is very simple, but it's important. It would finally demand and require execution and enforcement of the so-called U.S. visit system, an entry-exit system to catch visa overstays. Mr. President, this system was first mandated by Congress in 1996. We've had 6 additional votes demanding it by Congress since then. The 9/11 terrorists were visa overstays. As a result, this system was strongly recommended, one of the top recommendations of the 9/11 Commission. We must put this in place as we act on immigration, Mr. President, and this amendment would get that done. I reserve the balance of my time.
Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I agree that we need to better track visa overstays. But a fully biometric entry-exit system at all air, sea, and land ports of entry is a kind of unrealistic trigger we can't adopt. Implementation of this amendment would be prohibitively expensive, cause all kinds of delays. In the Judiciary Committee, we adopted an amendment offered by Senator Hatch that presents a more reasonable approach. So I would urge a no vote on this amendment. As for yeas and nays.
Mr. President, is there any time remaining?
9 seconds left, sir.
Mr. President, we've talked about this for 1996. 9/11 happened. When are we going to do it, if not now? I urge support of the amendment.
Is there a sufficient second? Appears to be a sufficient second. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Scott. King. Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Chiesa, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cowan, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Bozeman, Burr, Chiesa, Coates, Coburn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Grassley, Hatch, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, Lee, Hall, Risch, Scott, Thune, Toomey, and Vitter. Mr. Heller, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Cowan, Donnelly, Feinstein, Blake, Franken, Gillibrand, Graham, Hagan, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Manchin, McCain, Menendez, Merkley, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Reed of Nevada, Rubio, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Stabenow, Udall of Colorado, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, no. Mr. Tester, no. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, no. Mr. Moran, aye. Ms. Ayotte, no. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Rockefeller, no. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Ms. Baldwin, no. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Coons, Mr. Coons, no. Ms. Cantwell, Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Hoven, Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Pryor, Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, no. Mr. Levin, no.
Are there any senators wishing to vote or change their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 36, the nays are 58. Under the previous order, requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to.
Move to reconsider.
Without objection. Under the previous order, there will now be 2 minutes of debate, equally divided prior to a vote on amendment number 1198, offered by the senator from Montana. Mr. Tester.
Mr. President, before we begin, can we have order?
Yes, we will, sir. Senators, please take your conversations outside the chamber if needed. Senate will come in order.
Mr. President.
Senator from Montana.
Thank you, Mr. President. This amendment will include tribal representatives on the DHS Border Task Force. In this country, within 100 miles of the border, we have 13 Indian reservations, some of them right on the border. If we're going to really make sure the borders are secure in the north and the south, Indians need to be a part of the conversation, our Native American friends. They have a unique government-to-government status, and as I said before, their input is critically important. This amendment won't cost anything, has bipartisan support, and it will add 2 tribal representatives, 2 on the north and 2 on the southern region, to the Department of Homeland Security Border Task Force. I encourage you for a yea vote on this amendment.
Mr. President.
The senator from Iowa.
Yeah. I have no problems with this amendment. It ensures that tribal communities are represented. The bill's task force is a new and independent entity designed to provide recommendations about immigration and border security. Mr. Tester is adding 4 additional members to the task force to ensure that the tribes are represented. However, this amendment doesn't fundamentally change the bill. There's really no opposition to making sure that the tribes have a voice in policy. Of course, this task force doesn't have any real power. It only makes recommendations. The Secretary isn't required to address their concerns or enact their recommendations. Too often, the Secretary doesn't take into consideration our recommendations. Even now, she has a hard time in implementing laws. So again, while the amendment is non-controversial, members should know that this task force is a fig leaf for actual border security.
Yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays have been called for. Is there a second? Sufficient second? There's a sufficient second. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Yes. Yes.
Good day, Brendan.
Messiah. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Balkus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Chiesa, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Baldwin, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt, Bozeman, Boxer, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Chiesa, Coates, Coburn, Collins, Coons, Corker, Cornyn, Cowan, Crapo, Cruz, Donnelly, Durbin, Enzi, Feinstein, Fisher, Flake, Franken, Graham, Grassley, Hagan, Hatch, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Heller, Hirono, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Kirk, Klobuchar, Leahy, Lee, Levin, Manchin, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Moran, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Hall, Portman, Pryor, Reed of Nevada, Risch, Roberts, Rockefeller, Rubio, Sanders, Schatz, Scott, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Thune, Toomey, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Vitter, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Sessions, aye.
Are there any senators wishing to vote or change their vote? If not, on this issue, the yeas are 94, the nays are 0. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is agreed to.
Move to reconsider.
Objection?
Table, yeah, and then table. Yeah. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Colorado.
Mr. President, I thank the senator from Vermont for yielding. I wanted to speak to what is a historic debate here on the floor of the United States Senate, and that's the debate we're having in regards to comprehensive immigration reform. We have here in the United States Congress a major opportunity to finally pass meaningful, strong, bipartisan legislation. Immigration reform is something that the Congress has grappled with in fits and starts for over a decade. In fact, I remember, Mr. President, the summer 7 or 8 years ago when this Senate came very close to passing comprehensive immigration reform and fell just short of that goal. But today, the need to act has become imperative. We can't ignore it. My constituents in Colorado from across the spectrum and across my state who are hardworking, they're small business owners, they're religious leaders, they're farmers, they're citizens. They believe that now is the time. And if you look at our economy, which is beginning to gain strength. The economy is beginning to get its legs under it. It, too, needs the labor market certainty that would come from immigration reform. So let's seize this opportunity, Mr. President, to pass common sense legislation that our constituents expect. Mr. President, I'm looking right over the dais, and on the dais, above the dais, I see E pluribus unum, out of many one. That's a simple motto. It's engraved in this great Senate chamber, and it's one of the daily reminders that we are a nation of immigrants. Throughout our history, millions of immigrants, including my ancestors and yours, braved hardship and great risks to come here. And why was that, Mr. President? They sought freedom, they sought opportunity, they wanted a better life for their families. And today's immigrants, in that same spirit, continue to brave great risks and hardship to attain the American dream. Now, we've heard from fellow Americans who are opposed to fixing our broken system, those who unfortunately see immigrants as a burden on our country, or who want to enact overly punitive measures to punish undocumented immigrants. And I would ask them to remember that our country was built, it was forged by immigrants whose blood and sweat built the America we know today. To oppose this legislation, with all due respect, Mr. President, is to deny the promise our ancestors and even the framers expected us to extend to those outside our borders. Yes, we are a nation of laws, and we don't take lightly the violation of our laws. But we are also a nation that welcomes foreigners who want to build the American dream. And I'd like to challenge my colleagues to remember that we are a better, stronger country because of our immigrants, whose first glimpse of America was the Statue of Liberty, emblazoned with the words by the poet Emma Lazarus, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." Our country and our economy were built from the ground up by the hard work and ingenuity of immigrants and their families. In recent years, 1 in 4 of America's new small business owners have been immigrants. 1 in 4 high-tech startups in America were founded by immigrants. And 40% of Fortune 500 companies, when they started, were created by either first or second-generation immigrants. Mr. President, if you look at our system today, unfortunately, because it's broken, it's made it harder for would-be business owners like I just described to create jobs and help spur our nation's economic development. Let me give you another example. Right now, our system invites the best and the brightest from all over the world to come and study at our top universities. Then once they've gotten the training they need to create a new invention or build a new business, listen to this. Our system tells them to go back home. That's not right. That's not right. I'm pleased and honored and humbled and a little bit proud, Mr. President, I've worked for years with Coloradans at my side to solve this problem and to make the U.S. a place where entrepreneurs are encouraged to stay, to build businesses, and to grow our economy. And in that vein, I want to thank the Gang of Eight for their hard work in crafting a bill that's built upon those principles. Entrepreneurs embody the American dream. But, Mr. President, fixing our broken system is about more than businesses and startups. It's principally about families. And let me tell you, to say that our current broken immigration system is bad for families would be an understatement. Thousands of fathers, myself included, gathered with their families this past weekend to celebrate Father's Day. And I couldn't help but think of the thousands of fathers our immigration system has separated from their loved ones, or the countless fathers living today in Colorado who struggle with the fear every day that they could be separated from their families. Fathers like Jorge. Jorge has been living in the United States for 23 years. He's the proud father of 4 U.S. citizen children, including a U.S. Army corporal. He's been contributing to our economy in Colorado and therefore to the American economy and his community for many, many years. And with immigration reform, Jorge will be able to come out of the shadows where he will be finally able to realize the American dream without the constant fear of being deported and separated from his children. And as I've suggested, Mr. President, unfortunately, Jorge's situation is not unique. The fact that our current system has brought us to the place where at any moment thousands of families can be ripped apart is just not right. This bill would give Jorge and millions of others like him a tough but fair shot at earning legal status and eventually citizenship. Make no mistake, this process will not be without significant cost and it will not be easy. Let me tell you why I draw that conclusion. In order to get earned legalization, Jorge would have to pass a background check, pay back taxes, penalties, and fees, demonstrate work history, learn English, and go to the back of the line behind others who have also gone through the process. This is a tough but fair road ahead, a path negotiated by senators of both parties and supported by the American people. Today, there are an estimated 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. Some cross the border illegally. Others have overstayed their visas. Regardless of how they came, the overwhelming majority of these folks, like Jorge, are just trying to earn a living and provide for their families. There are thousands of immigrants, Mr. President, in Colorado, like Jorge, working in the shadows, where they are vulnerable to exploitive employers, paying them less than the minimum wage, making them work without overtime, and denying them any of the benefits given to their other employees. That pushes down standards for all workers. What I'm saying is that our current immigration system has fostered an underground economy that exploits a cheap source of labor while depressing wages for everyone else. My conclusion is that this bill will ensure that businesses are all playing by the same set of rules, and it includes tough penalties for businesses that do not. The underlying bill implements an effective employment verification system that will prevent identity theft in the hiring of unauthorized workers and send a clear message that will help prevent future waves of illegal immigration. That's a common sense solution. That's the kind of solution I've heard Coloradans ask for. Now let me turn to the border, Mr. President. This legislation contains historic resources and measures to better secure our borders. Last week I heard time and time again, borders first, borders first. And to the Coloradans who expect border security like I do, I say the best thing we can do for border security is pass a comprehensive immigration reform bill. Let me talk about the progress we've made over the last several years. We put $17 billion in resources to protect our borders. And as a result, illegal border crossings are near their lowest level in decades. Now, let's be clear, there's still room for significant improvement, and the strong border security provisions in this bill help us get there. And in fact, the underlying bill would be the biggest single commitment to border security in our nation's history. Why? Well, it would put another $6.5 billion on top of what we were already spending towards stronger, smarter, more innovative security along our borders. It would also direct the Secretary of Homeland Security to submit to Congress a comprehensive border security plan and a southern border fencing strategy. Moreover, the legislation would delay the process of granting legal status to immigrants until the plan and strategy have been deployed, a mandatory employment verification system has been implemented, and an electronic biographic entry-exit system is in place at major airports and seaports. Finally, this legislation would hold employers more accountable if they knowingly hire undocumented workers. We are saying that no longer will we tolerate an underground market of workers who are illegally employed and many times exploited. And let me turn, as I begin to close, Mr. President, to a special group of Coloradans who would be helped. And this is a group about whom we all should care and who I certainly care deeply about, and that's our students. And I'm very pleased and excited that the provisions from the DREAM Act are included in the comprehensive immigration reform bill that we're considering. I've stood alongside a steadfast group of my colleagues as we fought for the passage of the DREAM Act for many years. And along the way, I've talked to and, more importantly, listened to countless Colorado students who've looked me in the eyes and asked for their government to help give them status and opportunity and potential so that they can go on to be the next generation of American leaders without the daily fear of deportation. We're talking about thousands of Colorado students who were brought to the United States at a very young age. It wasn't their decision to be brought here, but they came here with their parents. That cohort, literally thousands of these wonderful, enthusiastic, energetic Coloradans, they're poised to graduate college or to join the military, in the process strengthen our country and grow our economy. Let's do the right thing by the dreamers. So, Mr. President, I say to my colleagues and I implore my colleagues, let's not stand in the way of what Americans want and what our economy needs. Our nation will be stronger when our borders are secure, when employers are held accountable for the workers they hire, when jobs are filled with qualified and documented workers who contribute to the economy, and undocumented workers who are currently here are held accountable and given an opportunity to earn their legal status and then citizenship. So for my colleagues who are here today who are serious about fixing our broken immigration system, let's actually have a serious debate to improve this legislation. Let's vote on amendments with a sincere intent to really improve this bill. Let's work productively to find a bipartisan solution to this huge national issue in the same way that the Gang of Eight have worked for the past many months. As I said in my opening remarks, Mr. President, we have a historic opportunity to finally pass comprehensive immigration reform. We have a historic opportunity to show the Senate at its best. Having the opportunity to openly and honestly debate this legislation is one of the many reasons we ran to serve in the Senate in the first place. The public has placed their trust in us to get this right, and we can. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.